Hey folks, Bret here. This video is a response to a question submitted by one of my longest standing Patreon supporters, Kevin Fothy. It's an excellent question. The question is there a cultural analog to senescence? Now, senescence is a term that is probably not terribly familiar to most of you, so I'm going to explain it a little bit and explain why it happens biologically, and then we can address Kevin's question. So senescence is what we typically refer to as aging. It is the tendency of creatures to become less efficient and more vulnerable with age. And it's a very interesting process. It's one I studied during my dissertation work. It happens for a reason we have come to understand pretty well evolutionarily. The reason is this: the genes in our genome have to do multiple jobs. There just simply aren't enough of them to do all of the work necessary to make a self-assembling 30 trillion cell, self-maintaining organism like ourselves. We have something like 20,000 genes in our protein coding genomes. Those genes may have 5 different edits on average per gene, which gives you something like 100,000 different combinations. That's not nearly enough to deal with all of the machinery of the 200 plus cell types that we have in our bodies and the long developmental program that puts all of these things in correct order. So it is necessarily true that genes will tend to do more than one thing. We call a gene that does more than one thing pleiotropic. It is a pleiotropy, and it means a gene that has multiple functions. So the key insight as to what this has to do with the process of senescence comes from one of the great evolutionary biologists of the 20th century, a guy named George Williams, who I knew before his death. George Williams recognized that pleiotropic effects would very often pull in different directions, and that for any gene where the benefit came early in life and the harm came late in life, selection would tend to favor the gene in spite of the harm. And the reason for that is fairly simple. The late life effect of that gene will not be experienced by nearly as many individuals as the early life benefit of the gene, because many individuals won't survive to experience it. So the later in life the negative effect happens, the less selection is capable of purging it from our genomes. This results in genes that have early life benefits and late life harms accumulating in our genomes, and creates a tendency for those late life effects to degrade our function over time, beginning not at birth, but beginning at the moment of first reproduction for the species. That is the usual moment at which individuals in that species begin reproducing. So for human beings, we don't measure senescence until an individual reaches something like 18 or 20 years of age, at which point decline begins to be measurable and it accelerates through the lifespan until there's nobody left. So the question is there a cultural analog to this process of selection, of senescence, that is driven by selection for early life benefits in spite of late life costs? And unfortunately, the answer is yes, and our economic and political systems are tailor-made to bring it about. And I believe we are actually seeing a kind of senescence unfold right before our eyes. Here's the reason. Our system has a fundamentally competitive nature at its core. And ideas that work in the short term but fail and cause vulnerability in the long term tend to survive in our system because they tend to produce economic benefit. So if you engage in the production of some technology that produces benefits for humanity over the course of several decades, and then the harm of that technology manifests over later decades, you will have become wealthy in the short term. That wealth will have resulted in an increase in your political influence, and therefore it will reinforce the belief structures that made it seem like a good idea in the first place. Even if the delayed costs of whatever modality it is that you introduced into the world far exceed the benefits that initially came from it. So the simple fact that the market tends to see those short-term gains and discount the long-term effects until the political structure has already been modified by that success will create a phenomenon that is not just like biological senescence, but I would argue is actually the very same process unfolding. Now, how would that manifest for us? It would manifest in a system that was incapable of going in reverse, a system that would drive off the cliff rather than recognize that something at its core was awry and leading us into danger. So that really couldn't be a better description of where we are. We have a system that makes us very comfortable in the short term. It provides for our needs, and it is liquidating the well-being of the planet at an incredible rate that analytically we know full well cannot continue. And yet we do not change course because of the senescence of civilization. Hey folks, if you like this video, click like, subscribe to the channel, and if you feel like supporting the creation of more content like this, head on over to my Patreon page and sign up at whatever level feels comfortable.